Ah, yes, friends. On a Monday, it is OGP, One Giant Podcast, where I'm Adam Arbrecht, your host here, and also covering the Brooklyn Nets for the Locked On Nets podcast, joined as always by the generational New York Football Giants fan. He's the healthy, the wealthy, and the wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz.
Adam, I'm feeling especially good this morning. This week is my week vacation with the family down at the beach, so I am down in Sea Isle City, New Jersey right now.
Oh, nothing makes me happier to hear that. This information was not exposed to me on the front end of doing the podcast. So my anticipation was just that you were trying to get your lovely wife, Kelly, and your beautiful son, Rory, out of the house for the day. It turns out you're actually on vacation.
Yes, I'm on vacation, and I was trying to, pack little snack pack sandwich bags and just say, hey, why don't you guys go take a little walk while, Adam and I talk a little bit of Giant shop here.
Oh, that's too good. Now, because that's that can be a difficult morning. There's a lot of moving parts there, but I want you to know that I'm on the same page. I made a delicious cup of drip coffee this morning, only to pour in some bad milk. I had started the process all over again. I'm talking about losing 3, maybe even 4 minutes of my morning.
That's tough, Adam. Are you going to be able to recover?
I'm fighting through. The coffee's good. And listen, I had Courtney. I told her to go take a little bit of a walk just so I could get some space and really clear my head mentally and lock myself into what's going to be a jam-packed episode, as we know. Oh, sorry. Please.
I was going to say, it's a good thing you told her to take a walk and not take a hike, because there could be some things that are lost in translation. Maybe, right. Your stuff will be on the street tomorrow.
It's interesting. Oddly enough, she never came back. It was a bit confusing to me. I must have crossed my wires there somewhere. We come into a jam-packed episode because Saturday night was the first preseason game. Listen, we knew what we weren't going to get, and that was a lot of the starters and maybe some of the insights that we wanted. But offensive line did play. Some key players around certain positions were out there on the field showcasing themselves. There's a lot of bright spots, and there's a couple of tip of the hats to Andy, to myself. There's some good things we're going to get into, but there's also some negative, and we're going to cover that as well. The Giants, who by tomorrow will need to cut down from 90 to 85, had the ability already to make a move because, unfortunately, TJ Brunson went down with an ACL. He'll be out for the year. That opened up a spot that the Giants went ahead and brought in, which I chuckle because it ties into another area of concern. But they went ahead and brought in Brian Lewerke. I don't know, I could be saying that wrong. Lewerke out of Michigan.
Michigan State.
Michigan State. Excuse me. I don't want to. Yes, don't. Please
don't upset the Spartan fans. Yeah, you don't want to upset. We have a big following in Michigan, so I just want to make sure.
It's true.
Yep.
Second only to the tri-state area is Michigan as far as OGP goes. But they brought him in. He played, I think, last year for the spring league for the NFL. Whatever. The point is, really, as we'll get into in a little bit, is that because of the play of the backup, specifically Thorson, I think that, who also suffered a minor injury of some kind in the preseason game, it just seemed to be clear that the Giants knew if you're looking to develop a quarterback, tragically, Thorson may have given you enough of a sample size in preseason game 1 to say he's not the guy that we want to develop.
Yeah, I mean, let's just be honest. The quarterback room behind Daniel Jones is not looking good. Lewerke was undrafted, was on the Patriots practice squad last year.
Correct.
He's one of those guys that has like a relatively normal floor, and his ceiling isn't very high. He's a guy that you're hoping can jump in and maybe, make the back end of a roster potentially. But the reason why we're even talking about him is because both of the two quarterbacks behind Daniel Jones, Mike Glennon and Clayton Thorson, looked terrible. They were like, let's not mince words here. The quarterback play was not good. There are many reasons why the quarterback play wasn't good, and that could bleed into other areas where we were not successful on Saturday night. But certainly, Giants had to make a move. I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't the only roster move at the quarterback position the Giants do before week 1.
Yeah, that's the assumption. So from there, we do talk about then, before we get into some of the standouts and the concerns coming out of Saturday night. Listen, first preseason game, again, we're going to say it all episode long. First preseason game, the reps, who you're going up against, you take it on the first or second team of the opposition, all that stuff, who you're playing alongside. It's all a factor, but there still are, to me, there's a handful of performances that are worth noting for very specific reasons. But on the cut down to 90, or sorry, I should cut down to 85 is what we should be saying here, from 90, What do you look at as far as, I want to say, automatics? Like, who are the automatics? Thanks so much. You're going to be out the door. I think maybe Thorson is going to fall into that category, right? Here's a guy that we're not going to be carrying three quarterbacks over the course of the season, and then a fourth one. I just don't see the world where they make it through. When you take a look at this roster and say, as I pull it up here, it's weird because when you look at the offensive line, you're going to get a handful of opportunities there because the Giants want to bring in and shuffle the deck there, so to speak, because they lost a handful of guys to retirement. So they want to improve the depth there, but that almost becomes a 1-for-1. You take a guy out, you're going to bring a guy back in, obviously. The other piece, though, to me is maybe the wide receiver room. I take a look at there, and you say a lot of guys, some that didn't even get a look on Saturday night, like Damon Willis actually is a good example of a player that flashed a little bit, caught a touchdown pass, certainly, at least showed you something. But you're in this mix of Austin Mack, right? You have a handful of wide receivers there that I think could fall into that cut line. Work our way through the rest of this roster here. The running back room is obviously another great spot where currently you're sitting there with Platzgummer, with Brightwell, with Alfred Morris, with Clement, and with Booker, obviously, too. And we're going to get into a little bit of the issues that came out of that particular that particular run there on Saturday night for the running back room. It's hard to gauge. It's hard to gauge where we think the Giants are automatically going to make these cuts. And what I do think is unique, and we didn't get a chance because our Thursday and into Friday episode was focusing on the players we want to watch for and things that we were interested in on Saturday night. But what we didn't get was an understanding that Joe Judge was going to treat this as fringe roster guys. They need to get a look, right? So a Tay Crowder that we said listed first on the depth chart on the Giants website, he got out there, got to have a lot of reps. I think he was decent, right? So we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like. But at the end of the day, it at least gave us an opportunity to see how he could perform, maybe as a depth piece inside of this rotation. Odiningbo was a guy that played later on. I don't think that he would be outright cut between 90 and 85, obviously. But the fact that he had back-end reps tells you kind of where he is in this hierarchy. Probably a little bit closer to being safe than not, you would think, because they just brought him in. And yet, you need to look standout stellar if you're going to be potentially number 2 on the depth chart somewhere and playing against third-string players against the opposition. So Saleh and Joe Judge had conflicting perspectives on how they were going to approach the preseason, and that made it a little bit unique in that regard as well. I'm just flipping over the defensive side of the ball right here. Guys that I think would automatically be up to be cut here. Quails would be one, the defensive end. We're going to get into some of the players that were on the field. We mentioned Brunson suffering that injury. Ryan Anderson could be, unfortunately, brought in and could already be gone because of the injuries that he's dealt with. Didn't see a good look at Ellerson Smith, also dealing with a little bit of injury as well because he was just drafted this year. You assume he's going to get the biggest benefit of the doubt. And then you get into some of those cornerback positions, right? Aaron Robinson's going to carry over for sure. But Sam Beal, we saw a lot of Madre Harper out there, which I thought was nice to see, and he looked respectable. But any of those guys, Chris Johnson, Chris Milton, right? There's going to be Jaron Williams at the cornerback spot, went through some safeties there as well. Those are all guys that are cut eligible. So I think it's very possible for the Giants to look across this roster and basically say, we have a handful of names here that we can chop 5 out and not really care. The difference is going to be, Andy, you can pick out 5 names and take them out. But then the Giants also need to get another 2 or 3 or 4 names potentially out in order to fill in some of the depth pieces that they want to across this roster potentially, if they want to do it before the next preseason game.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you talking about the cornerback position as one of the spots. There's likely going to be, the challenges in our secondary. There are going to be good players that the Giants may have to potentially release when they get down to cuts because things are so thin at other positions. Like you look at the offensive line, it's a revolving door right now. And we're trying to find answers, on the offensive line. And we need more roster spots to be able to find those people. In the secondary, you kind of already have the safety and cornerback room pretty shored up. And some of those back end guys, like you said, Amadre Harper, for instance, might be, a casualty of just the way the Giants are structured right now.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting, right? Because that's what we're going to move into. Really, the bulk of this episode that we wanted to get to was Saturday night and what our takeaways were from it. I mentioned Harper, right? He was out there early and often. I thought he played respectably. I thought he had a good physical presence on the outside there. Listen, passes were being completed against him, so you take one with the other. But the bottom line is he was able to perform at a respectable level, I think, in a starting role. And that means that in a depth role, he at least showed up a little bit. Now, again, as we said, this is Joe Judge putting the players that are at the biggest risk potentially of being cut in a position to show what they're capable of. He, I think, at least earned himself an opportunity to be here in preseason game number 2 and maybe get a second look. We'll have to see how it shakes out. You mentioned the crowded secondary that we have there, especially with young players and draft picks, right? That injured or otherwise aren't going to go anywhere. Rodarius Williams, big hype throughout camp. He was out there. He got picked on a bit, but what I will say, and let's just, we're starting in the secondary, so let's stay there. What I liked about it was he's a young kid. Like, he's a late round draft pick, and he was out there. He didn't look lost, right? Passes were being completed against him, but he looked like he was in the right spot. He looks like he has the right physical traits and tools. Like, that's the kind of showing in a preseason game 1 that you basically say, hey, we can cut Sam Beal now.
I mean, that's I'm shocked that Sam is still on the roster. TJ Brunson going down maybe just allowed them to make a roster move without having to cut anyone. But yeah, I mean, Rowe, as they like to call him, did not really look. It looked like the moment was just a little too big for him, and that's okay. But that's okay. Like, you're a late round pick. You're trying to make this team. I think he showed enough in training camp and taking on one of these larger roles to be able to warrant, sticking around and making this roster. Think about it. Adoree Jackson is going to be out there. James Bradbury are going to be out there. We always talk about putting these people in the right situation for success. And obviously having him out there on an island alone against guys that are trying to prove something in the preseason is not necessarily the best situation for him. But, we'll see. I expect him to be much, much better in the next preseason game for the Giants.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because we talk about players that are on the roster bubble, them getting a chance here. In the secondary, it's all these guys that we know are definitely studs and starting. Then I think, to me, and we talked about this being a mixed bag, right? In the secondary, I think it's guys you want to see get reps because you hope that they can be the depth piece. All the other names that are in behind them, I mentioned, the Sam Beals of the world, the Jaron Williams, these are guys that I think are, we can cut them and not really care. We brought the Chris Johnson, right? There's a lot of guys there that have been brought in, and I think you want to confirm either a young draft pick or a guy that's been with the team. Hey, if you can show us, then we'll go ahead and we'll stick with you. And it'll be interesting to see when the Yadams of the world and some of these other guys get out there on the field and what that looks like for them and how it shuffles the deck. Moving down in towards the line, then, if we go into the linebacking group, I'm going to come right out and I'm going to take a big leap here. After, obviously, we saw some nice play from some of the guys early on there. I want to get into Cam Brown a little bit. Joe Judge had some comments, too. Carter Coughlin, listen, there's going to be plenty of time for both of us to trumpet our horns here a little bit on this. His transition from outside to inside, he looks the part. I know he played against, second and third string, basically, when he gets onto the field, but he looks like he can do it. He just looks like he is the type of not everything you want, but he does a little bit of everything well enough that you can pair him alongside Blake Martinez. I think that he is pushing closer and closer to being the starter next to Blake Martinez.
I got to give you credit where credit's due. He looked the part, didn't he? That's pretty much the simple answer. We talked about Rodarius Williams, and we're like, moment was a little too big. We'll have to reset it. You look at Carter Coughlin switching positions. He's basically like, I just want to play, and they put him inside, and he looks athletic. I sometimes people say jack of all trades, Swiss Army knife, whatever. It's just sometimes he just gets the job done. When he was in there, he looked good. He looked athletic. He seemed like a good complement to Blake Martinez, who's a tackling machine. He looks a little bit bigger. It seems to be working. I like it. It's nice that someone is starting to set themselves apart from some of the other players, and you get to take your victory lap that it's your boy Carter Coughlin that's doing it.
Well, listen, and it's all about the diamond in the rough, right? You take a guy that late in the draft, and if he can turn out to be this developmental player that, as Blake Martinez exits at the end of his contract, you're transitioning to Carter Coughlin being the signal caller in the middle of this defense. I'd be ecstatic for it. I'm just excited that it looks like it's going that way. Reggie Ragland gets out on the field there. God, he's enormous. I mean, he's borderline a defensive lineman. You could almost play him in behind a Dexter Lawrence if you wanted to with his height and size. Clearly, he's there for the run support element of this, and it looks like that's going to be effective. You can touch on him. Odenigbo, though, he got in late in this game, and he's listed at 6'3", 250 plus, but he looks small. I don't know how that's possible, and I just wondered what your takeaway was from when he came into the game specifically, because you would think, again, by the standard that Joe Judge has given us, that he's more secure in his roster spot, and yet when you come in later, you need to look better. You need to look almost dominant in those opportunities.
Well, yeah, it's a catch-22 when you have someone like Odenigbo who comes in, who was signed with the intention clearly of being a factor and a contributor on this team, never mind missing or making the cut from 90 down. So it's tough because you want the players that you're really unsure about to go up against the best level competition in these preseason games, and that's in the first quarter. So, like, some people say, well, we'll just put our number 2s out there in the first quarter and get them some reps in case one of our number 1s gets injured. Joe Judge is having that different approach, as you mentioned, where it's like, no. I need to evaluate certain players. It's not about where your rank in the pecking order decides what quarter you play in. And so I honestly think that that's the case. Maybe Odenigbo needed a few reps. He wanted to get him in there, make him feel comfortable. But there's other guys that he's just more concerned with, making the roster. So if you're locked into, the third outside pass rushing position for the Giants, what is he going to be able to show against backup guys at the beginning that's going to change his role? He's not going to move up. And then you're also doing yourself a disservice because you're not allowing some of these other players to get those valuable reps to find out if they can make the roster or not.
And interestingly enough, and then we're going to move into, I think, one more tip of the cap on the defensive side and then hit the offense, is Cam Brown, who didn't see any defensive snaps. But I think in the way you're talking about it, right, we all know Joe Judge, special teams guy. He has, and he said in the post game, I want certain players, their path is going to be about, can you give me baseline special teams value? That's not saying that Cam Brown isn't going to be a defensive contributor. It means I know where he probably is in the pecking order, right? He's probably third in a couple of spots on the defensive side of things. He can maybe rotate to a couple different areas, but if he can show me he can be effective on special teams, then I check that box and keeping his roster spot becomes a lot easier. And to that end, Cam Brown did a great job. He was down on every single punt. He was in position to make plays on special teams. So I think Cam Brown did a nice job for himself in that regard. The other big player, I think, no pun intended, Danny Shelton, good Lord, on a 3rd and 1 and a 4th and 1 opportunity, you want to put in, you lost Alvin Tomlinson. You can replace him by talent or just by sheer mass. And when that dude walked in there, he stuffed those couple of plays, and I think that was a real box checked for saying, we have Austin Johnson, we have B.J. Hill, these guys are going to be rotating. That's great. And then when you want to really stop something, you throw this mountain of a man into the middle. I loved the very small and effective sample size of Danny Shelton.
Doesn't it kind of remind you from size-wise and just his ability of like Snacks Harrison, right? Yeah. Like that ability just to come in. It's like, I do something and I do it well. And that's just clog this up and make it a whole mess for you to be able to run through. Yeah, situationally, he's going to be great. We were surprised when the depth chart came out originally that Shelton wasn't listed as the starter. But you can see he's going to have a role. The defensive line is going to be shifting in and out. We know for a fact that Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence are going to play as many snaps as they possibly can. Situationally, we're going to have guys like Shelton come in across the line and be able to contribute there.
Now, on the offensive side of the ball, we talked about the quarterback situation. Okay, that's great, whatever. And offensive line-wise, I think there's some clear things that happened on Saturday night that I think, I don't know, that maybe got lost in the wash a little bit. So a lot of praise was put on Will Hernandez. I think rightfully so. He pulled on a really nice running play, got out on a block. It looks like he is reforming himself in this system and should be effective. Talking about Wiggins seems like a waste. He's not going to be the starter. I get that, it wasn't a great performance. He's not supposed to be in there. Thomas's name, Nick Gates' name, they don't get mentioned on Saturday night. That's a good thing. Matt Pert, he gave up an early sack. Then he pancaked somebody. And the general consensus seemed to be, a little up and down, but he sure showed some things. There was a handful of plays, though, that I watched him on that right side where he was caught flat-footed, reaching out for the defender. And it just, again, not to read too much into it, but it did feel a little bit like this is some technique stuff that you wouldn't have thought you would have seen, right? If you're engaging, getting beat by someone, that's one thing. But to look like you're, in some ways, what Thomas was doing last year early on, right? A little bit like the mechanics were out of whack there. I don't want to overemphasize it, but that's a name automatically. I circle that big red highlighter and go, next preseason game, those reps better look a heck of a lot different for Matt Pert.
Yeah, and the reps should look some kind of mix of Matt Pert and Nate Solder on the right side to be able to figure out what's going on. Because I'll be honest with you, Adam, I would love to eat crow and have Matt Pert be an all-pro. Like, I would love it. It's just similar to how you love Evan Ingram because he is a Giant. You want him to do well. I want Matt Pert to do well. I hope that he's going to do well. This is my concern that I've had for a while, is the Giants are basically saying, oh, we saw enough from Matt Pert. He's the bookend on the other side to Andrew Thomas. And yeah, that one time he got absolutely beat was bad. And those are all it takes is one of those hits where Daniel Jones fumbles and the other team runs it back for a touchdown in the regular season, and we lose a game because of that. Yeah, they basically said, he had a mixed bag of things. That's not what we want. I don't want a mixed bag. He doesn't need to be pancaking people. I just want him to keep Daniel Jones upright. Like, don't make sensational plays. We didn't hear Nick Gates' name once. That to your point, it's like, great, he didn't do anything astronomical, but he also didn't cost the Giants in any way, shape, or form. That's the type of consistency we need across the offensive line. And yeah, man, the Pert, Wiggins, to your point, it doesn't even need to be discussed. The big problem with Wiggins is, like, this is how thin it is at the guard position right now. Anywhere on the free agent market or otherwise. We know Shane Lemieux is going to come back. We don't necessarily even know Shane Lemieux is going to be the guy. Joe Looney retires. Zach Fulton's no longer here. We are so thin at guard right now that the Giants are going to stand pat and wait for some of these teams to cut down their rosters and see if someone comes available. But if this continues, or Shane Lemieux's struggling to come back, the Giants might need to invest a draft pick and trade with someone that is a veteran on another team that maybe could be a cap casualty or something.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting if they want to get ahead of the line and not wait for a player necessarily to get cut. They signed Ted Larson. He couldn't play in Saturday. Wasn't ready yet. There's already an indication they're going to sign someone before Saturday night. So to your point, right, you're going to see who gets cut, bring in a guy. You won't see him in preseason game number 2. But certainly you want to try to rotate this, right? A guy like Slade, who did not look good either on Saturday, by the way, and he's an older veteran. Like, he needs to be chopped. You need to replace him with someone better. And to your point, hopefully Nate Solder is able to get out there. Worst case scenario for me, I want to see, as you say, players do well. If he can just show that he's a very capable backup and maybe capable of saying, hey, if someone like Pert is looking inconsistent, you don't have to pancake. You just have to not give up the big plays. And that's what we're talking about in terms of what we want to see in the first preseason game. Behind the offensive line, though, and this is where, unfortunately, this is weird for me because, okay, right off the bat, Booker did not look good, right? He looks sluggish. He doesn't look terribly effective. It's not entirely not reminiscent of the way Saquon Barkley looked behind, like the bad offensive line play where you want to get something done and it's not developing. And when you're not necessarily a speed back, it's a little bit harder. But it tells me that everything you're hearing out of camp is true, that he hasn't looked great. Clement here's the problem is Clement looked good. And I'm not drawing attention to the fumble as being Buddy fumbled it, right? Because he had little burst and it was great. The problem is that when we went inside the stats, this is a guy that averages a fumble every 33 carries in his career. That's the problem. So the fumble is more this indication of, and that's why you had a hard time staying on rosters. And it's why, theoretically, when we talk about where the cut's going to come from, it could still be him in spite of looking pretty effective because there could be another back out that they want to go get. And for better or worse, Booker isn't going anywhere because, and maybe rightfully so, as people had said, maybe they overspent on him. There's guaranteed money there. He's not going to go anywhere. I'm going to give Booker a little bit more leash, as far as it goes. But did Clement show you enough positive to negate the negative?
Well, but, yes, to me he did. And, we heard throughout training camp that Clement was the guy. He's looked great and Booker hasn't looked great. And the same thing played out in the preseason game. Now, I mean, you're talking about Booker only getting 3 carries, right? So
yes.
It's such a small, it's such a small sample size. We talked about the offensive line. Didn't look that great. it just seemed like Corey Clement provides a different dynamic than Booker does in the backfield. Like when Clement was getting touches, you're like, oh, he could break this for a nice 10-yard gain. Like you felt like there was different like ways the Giants offense could move with him there. The fumble is inexcusable. And to your point, if he ends up coughing it up again in the next preseason game, like that you're basically writing your own ticket. You're like, we like you. It looks like you can run the ball well, but your problem throughout your career is that you've put the football on the ground, and we just can't have that. So like, as much as we like you and as much as you're showing that you're working hard, like you cannot give up that ball. So I'm excited about how he looked. I think if he sits down and says that was an aberration, it won't happen again, and tries to figure this out and works with the coaches, great. Because I think there's a scenario 4 weeks into the season where he's the backup running back and Booker isn't anymore. But again, I don't want to overreact too much. It's 3 rushes for Booker. He could have been just saving it. It could have been just to get, his pads knocked around a little bit and not really do anything else. So let's not go too crazy over it.
Right. And Clement coming in later, playing against backups, right? So that the field is a little bit easier to navigate. Certainly. No, but you're right, though. I'll be very interested to see. We'll hear what happens with the Giants, multiple practices against the Cleveland Browns before they play them in a second preseason game. So we'll get some indications there against competition. And then I think on both sides, right? If you're Joe Judge, you're going to look at 3 carries kind of tells me, again, that the Booker isn't going anywhere. So they're not going to overexert him in the preseason. But if you're looking at Clement, you say, go ahead, get your reps. Let's see, buddy. We're going to get you 15 reps in preseason game number 2, 15 carries for you, touches. If you cough up enough, that's it. Like, you need to show that you're capable of doing it, because we can't afford to have you, to your point, by week 4, be the actual backup. And then when you come in on a solid drive, things are moving, Saquon just needs a breather, and you go in and cough it up. It just, you can't afford to do it. One last quick note in the running back group, because I couldn't get out of there without saying it. How about that? How about that Sandro Platzgummer? That kid's got some spark. He's got a little bit of what you want. He got out of the end zone, right on the shadow of the goal line, got the Giants out of there, had a really big run. This is where the quarterback play, I think, was unfortunate, because there was a pass later on from Thorson that was just thrown violently high and hard from about 7 yards away that could have let Platzgummer maybe showcase himself a little bit more. All I'll say is, again, you can't put too much into these reps, but in preseason game number 2 or 3, I think he should see some more reps, because you show it against maybe the worst possible competition. Now, how do you look against slightly better and slightly better? If he can showcase something, Alfred Morris was in there for some reps too. I mean, I don't think, if we assume that Gary Brightwell is a guy that they want to get to the practice squad to start the year, or, he's not going to have a roster spot necessarily, I can't say that there isn't a world where Platzgummer might be worthy of the 4th running back position, right? Behind whatever combination of Barkley, Booker, and Clement. Like, could Platzgummer see a roster spot? Maybe, and you at least have to give him the sample size. It was at least exciting to see him out there. It's very intriguing to me how this roster breaks down and how much stock Joe Judge puts in, a couple of nice plays.
Well, again, if Clement keeps going out there and fumbling the ball, he may have an opportunity to make this roster, to your point. And it's
the number 3 running back.
Right. He could be the number 3 for all we know. And the simple answer with a guy like Platzgummer is that when you think about what you want to see from him in order to understand anything, you saw what you wanted to see from him. He looked competent. He looked a little bit shifty. Like he looked the part. That's all you can do. Yeah. He's a guy that we said is probably not going to make this roster, but even the mere fact that we're talking about maybe there's a world where he can break through if he has another couple of really good preseason games, speaks volumes for him. And the Giants are trying to develop him, a la Carter Coughlin. Like, we draft someone or sign someone late. Let's work them through the system and actually teach them and see if they can be part of this roster long term, not just contribute immediately.
Yeah, no, for sure. And listen, worst case scenario, this is a guy that gets through the practice squad again, and he's down there. I mean, just as a big picture thing, the Giants, I think, would love it if Brightwell and Platzgummer were beating out Alfred Morris and Clement, right? Like, you prefer it to be the young players. You'd like to have those young players in behind Barkley and in behind Booker, but you have to earn that, right? And the reps, you see it in practice, you see it on game day if they warrant it. Before we get to the wide receiver group, because there's a couple of standout there, I got to say, man, we hadn't had a chance to see him. Injury last year. Rice and John, I'm going to say it right now. He to me did everything that he needed to, and he did it in a way that I didn't anticipate. So he's regarded as being a strong blocker. That's fantastic. You saw him used on the offensive line effectively as a sixth offensive lineman. You also saw him line up in the backfield in a fullback role. You saw him catch it out of the backfield. He showcased the right level of athleticism and ability, where I think that when you look at that tight end group, that's it, man. It's Evan Ingram, it's Rudolph, obviously, it's Caden Smith, and then it's Rice and John to me. Clear cut. If these other tight ends can show me something in the next couple of games. He got out there and did everything absolutely perfect to make a case to make the roster spot. And I'm not overreacting to this stuff, but it's like there's the world where, okay, what's Caden Smith's value now that you have Kyle Rudolph relative to also having Evan Ingram? If Rudolph is healthy, like Rice and John, to me, as of this moment today, earned himself a roster spot. He can lose it. Other players can take it from him, but I think that he's worthy of being on this roster because he can do it. Again, you're thin at offensive line. He can give you some of that. He's the best regarded in some ways outside of maybe a couple of these guys they brought in, but he's the best blocking tight end that they have on the roster potentially. So I don't see how you can look past him. I was really impressed by him on Saturday night.
I had to scour the internet when the Giants first picked him up because he played in Canada, and the video that I saw on some of the tapes, it was unbelievable. It's why he became, you have Carter Coughlin, I have Rising John as one of my favorite guys, and yeah. I'm glad that the Giants are giving him a look. Adam, he is 6'7". Yep. He's huge. He brings a different dimension to the tight end room. He brings a different dimension in the tight end position across the offensive line. To your point, he is a big, strong athlete. Like he is an athlete. You talked about the different places that they line him up. It's exciting, and I would say that his upside compared to Caden Smith or Hikatini or any of the other tight ends that make home, like it's off the charts. Like he far and away has the most upside of any of those types of guys. And if the Giants can find a way to unlock it, he's still a little bit raw, but you see his athleticism is pretty much the reason why he's getting out there and doing it. Like he's just a football player. If he gets a little bit more technique, like he could be very, very dangerous for the Giants.
And if you think about the offensive line and how many guys you're going to carry into the regular season, if you want to carry a fourth tight end on the active roster, then I think that he makes a good case for it. Coming into it, Hikatini was listed ahead of him on the depth chart. I don't think, Hikatini didn't do anything bad or good per se. So I put Rice and John above him now. And now you go into preseason game number 2, see if he can confirm that, right? You check that box and you just keep moving along. And all of a sudden, maybe he finds a roster spot. I was really surprised. For his size, you don't think of a player like that at the tight end position also having that type of athleticism. And he showcased it. So that was really good for him. Last but not least, we'll just touch on the wide receiver group here. We didn't get to see John Ross because he didn't play. So that was a disappointment after we were previewing and having some excitement. Probably tells you again that he's closer to being a part of this roster than not. Sills was out there. CJ Board was out there. What did you see from both of them? Different areas. Obviously, CJ Board on special teams, I think, showed up for the Giants. And then Sills really, even with poor quarterback play, I think showcased a nice skill set for the Giants.
I much similar to how you feel about certain players. I watched David Sills out there, and I was like, "Oh yeah, he's on this roster." Like I know it's against second string guys, but like he looked strong. He looked big. He looked like he was not afraid to go up and try to go high point balls and get them for the Giants. As you mentioned, some of these balls that were thrown by Glennon and Thorson were not really ones that David Sills could necessarily even get a beat on. There was a couple different penalties that he drew, because the defensive backs weren't even able to keep up with him. I was very impressed, and I honestly think he is, one more of these showings, and he's basically saying, I'm the last wide receiver in the wide receiver room. Like, I made the commitment in the offseason to go with Daniel Jones. I made the commitment to figure out how I could get chemistry with him. I'm doing all this even without Daniel Jones on the field. Like, I'm playing with any of these backups. Imagine if I have a guy that can throw me the ball, what I could do, right?
And a lot of what I liked about his game was, even regardless of the catch or if it went his way, when they showed him off the line, the ability to get separation, right? To have shiftiness off the line of scrimmage, get away from the coverage. So I think he looks like a receiver, right? It's the eye test when you see the guy go, yeah, he can do it. As opposed to, by the way, a guy that I thought, and this is just a name to throw out, Alex Bachmann. You're one of the 5 for me, because you just look like a guy that doesn't have much to showcase, doesn't, you're just a body. You're just a warm body out there. On the other side of it, with a guy like Dante Pettis, I think that, again, because of quarterback play, really hard to evaluate what his game looked like, because there was a handful of plays that were thrown his way, nowhere near him, but they were thrown allegedly to him, where you saw his frustration. And I think Pettis may be going in the direction of, unfortunately, we bring in John Ross, we draft Kadarius Toney, and you're left kind of in this no man's land. And if you don't get the chance to showcase it, for your fault or otherwise, it may just come down to practice sessions. And if you're not showing it in practice, it's going to be hard for game day to be an opportunity over the course of preseason.
I mean, when you think about the wide receiver room, and I think about it like, there's only so many musical chairs. Like, the music stops and someone's not going to be able to have a seat on this roster. Yeah. And when you know for a fact that Galladay, Shepard, Slayton, and Toney are going to be guaranteed on this roster, that's 4 wide receivers already. How many wide receivers could the Giants possibly have on their active roster, right? Like, are they going to go 5? If they go 5, all intentions say that it probably is going to be John Ross right now if he can stay healthy. If they go 6, next guy in line to me is Sills. Like, it's pretty clear as day that he's separating himself from that Bachmann, Pettis, Austin Mack group of wide receivers. Like, he just looks better than them. And so,
and then CJ Board, right?
Yeah, and CJ Board.
It's funny too, because he almost got used like a Kadarius Toney, I think, on the end around sweep that you saw from him. But again, in that same vein we talked about, right? Like for like, if you have Kadarius Toney, then it could be John Ross, CJ Board. If you have Kenny Galladay, now you have Sills. Like, you want to have this kind of 1-for-1, and Pettis could be that guy. But right now, and again, I guess it's to be fair, right? Pettis got put out there early. So that tells you that he's a guy that's at the back end of this thing. Pettis came in a little bit later. So maybe this perception around where Pettis is a little bit more fluid than we realize. I think that CJ Board can win himself a roster spot potentially, whereas I don't know what Pettis, again, it just feels like Pettis is in this weird no man's land. Unless you blow up in a preseason game, it just feels like, okay, if it's all relative, the 26-year-old wide receiver versus any other position on this team, yeah, we're going to go the other way.
Yeah, and the simple thing is CJ Board fills a need more than Dante Pettis does.
Yes.
Like, CJ Board does it all. He can be on special teams. He can do different end-around things out of the backfield. He serves multiple purposes on this roster if he decides to make it. When you're choosing between Dante Pettis or Sills, and Sills commits himself completely in the offseason, looks great already in the first preseason game, it's like, what are you doing better than any of these guys to separate yourself? I'm just not seeing it. I was big on Dante Pettis being a contributor this season before they made some of the different moves with Kadarius Toney and Kenny Galladay and others, but I just don't see a spot for him as of today. But guess what? That's why we play more preseason games, Adam.
And that's why, at the end of the day, this is only one of 3. As we said, they're going to have multiple practice sessions with the Cleveland Browns before they play them. They're going to have multiple practice sessions with the New England Patriots before they play them in the final preseason game. Tomorrow is the 17th. That's going to represent the cut-down day. 5 roster spots need to get opened up. So we'll be back in on Wednesday highlighting who got cut. Hopefully it's nowhere near any of the guys that we've highlighted as being some of our favorite standouts from Saturday night. But they'll cut down 5 players and then probably a couple more. And as we work through the rest of the week, I safely assume you'll see them also bring in some other members from other rosters. So, you say 5 to get the cut down, but I'd push that number closer to 8 probably for the Giants if they're planning on bringing in some other bodies from other teams to get a couple of looks at. Shane Lemieux is supposed to be back on the mend, so he should be building towards getting out there for a preseason game potentially. Hopefully, Nate Solder, another guy. So there's help in these practice sessions and the next preseason games to come at some of these key positions, but all we can do is break it down, man. All we can do is plant our flag as I've done, I think, fairly aggressively today with a number of players and see if they end up making the cut as we move through the week. You can follow us on social media at One Giant Podcast. You can head over and review, subscribe to the podcast where we get those needs fulfilled. And as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and certainly demand that the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.
Yeah.